He walked in for a simple meal. She saw a target. When a cocky waitress demands upfront payment from the wrong man, she thinks she's in control. But when Shaq flips the script in the most unexpected way, the entire diner watches in stunned silence. By the time they realize who he really is, it's too late. No yelling, no threats, just a lesson they'll never forget. How do you fix a mistake when the whole world is about to see it? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The bell above the door jingled as Big Shaq stepped into the diner. The sound was small, almost insignificant. Yet in that moment, it felt like it carried more weight than it should have. The Maplewood Diner had the kind of old-fashioned charm that made it feel like a place stuck in time. The walls were lined with faded black and white photos of smiling customers from decades past. A jukebox in the corner played soft rock from another era, barely loud enough to be noticed. It smelled like fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and pancakes dripping in syrup, comforting scents that had welcomed countless customers before him. But as Shaq walked in, something in the air shifted. The din of conversation softened, just slightly. It wasn't outright hostility. Not yet. Just a hesitation. A moment of assessment. A silent decision being made. He had seen it before. Felt it before. It wasn't new. Shaq didn't react. He simply rolled his shoulders back, keeping his posture loose and relaxed, the way he always did when walking into unfamiliar territory. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He just wanted a meal. He walked toward the counter, his broad frame moving effortlessly, though he could feel a few pairs of eyes trailing his steps. The stools along the counter were mostly empty, except for a man in a worn-out baseball cap sipping coffee and an older woman flipping through a newspaper. Shaq slid onto a stool, resting his hands on the counter. A moment later, a waitress appeared. She wasn't smiling. Linda, according to the name tag pinned to her uniform, was a woman in her late 40s. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if the very act of acknowledging him was an inconvenience. She looked at him the way people looked at bad weather approaching, a flicker of judgment, a quiet assumption. Shaq had seen that look before too. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice clipped. Shaq nodded. "Sure." "Black." Linda didn't write it down. She just turned toward the coffee pot, moving with the slow reluctance of someone who didn't want to be here. Shaq exhaled, glancing at the menu taped to the counter. It was old, the edges curling. Simple food. Pancakes, eggs, burgers, sandwiches. A few moments later, the coffee cup clinked onto the counter in front of him. No sugar, no spoon, just the coffee. Linda folded her arms. "You eating or just drinking?" Shaq didn't react to the tone. He just nodded at the menu. "Yeah, I'll take the pancakes, eggs, and sausage." She nodded, reaching for her notepad, but then something changed. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had a different edge to it. "That'll be $12.50, she said. "Up front." Shaq didn't react right away. He just blinked, slow, measured. Then he tilted his head slightly, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" Linda shrugged, unapologetic. "It's our policy." Shaq's fingers tapped lightly against the counter. He wasn't the kind of man who overreacted. Never had been. But that didn't mean he was the kind of man to let things slide either. A few feet away, the man in the baseball cap had stopped sipping his coffee. The older woman with the newspaper hadn't turned the page in a while. Even the cook behind the counter, flipping bacon on the grill, had glanced up for a second too long. Linda just stared at him, waiting. Shaq let a beat of silence stretch between them before he spoke again. "That right?" His voice was calm, easy, almost amused. Linda nodded once. "Yeah." Shaq's brows lifted slightly. He glanced around the diner. The man in the booth by the window, sipping his milkshake, not a care in the world. The couple near the entrance, eating their fries, their check sitting untouched on the table. The 3 teenagers in the corner, laughing over a plate of waffles. No one had asked them for money up front. "Funny," Shaq murmured, turning back to Linda. Nobody else paid yet. Her expression didn't change. "That's our policy," she repeated, "for certain customers." That word hung between them. Certain. Shaq smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't angry either. It was the kind of smile that made people nervous. A slow, knowing smile. Certain customers, he echoed, nodding slightly. Right. The diner was silent now, not in an obvious way, not in a way that said people were directly listening, but in a way that said they were aware. Linda shifted on her feet, as if finally feeling the weight of the moment, but she didn't back down. Listen, she said, her voice tight now. You can pay, or you can leave. It's that simple. Shaq exhaled through his nose. He had a choice. He could walk away. He could drop a few bills on the counter and let it go. But that wasn't the point. The point was the people watching, the ones waiting to see what he'd do, the ones who would either remember this as the day a man let himself get disrespected, or the day someone finally spoke up. Shaq scratched his jaw, then reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and pulled out a single $100 bill. He placed it on the counter. Linda's lips twitched like she thought she'd won, until Shaq tapped the bill with his finger, then pushed it toward her. Run it, he said. Linda blinked. Excuse me? Run it, he repeated, his voice calm, unwavering. For 100. Keep the change. For the first time, Linda hesitated. And Shaq? Shaq just smiled again. The kind of smile that said, I just flipped the script. The kind of smile that said, you have no idea what you just walked into. The kind of smile that said, game on. The diner was no longer just a place for coffee and eggs. It had become a stage, a test of character, and every single person in the room was about to see the real story unfold. Because this wasn't just about breakfast anymore. It was about who would walk away with their dignity intact, and who would walk away realizing they had just made the biggest mistake of their life. The diner's air had changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like a storm brewing in the distance, the kind you don't see until it's too late. Shaq could feel it. The weight of unspoken rules, unspoken biases, and unspoken expectations. But he wasn't the type to let something slide just because it was unspoken. Linda stood across the counter, arms folded, a smug smirk creeping across her lips as she waited for an answer she already thought she knew. She had played this game before. She knew how it ended, or so she thought. Shaq drummed his fingers against the countertop, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. His voice, however, held an edge, just sharp enough to be felt, but not reckless enough to be dismissed. Tell me something, he said, his tone even, controlled. Why do I have to pay up front when nobody else does? A pause. Not long, but just long enough to make Linda's smirk widen. Oh, it's just our policy, she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. You know, some folks have a habit of walking out without paying. We've learned to be careful. Shaq's fingers stopped drumming. The diner didn't go silent, not entirely. But something changed in the rhythm of it. A shift in energy. Across the room, a man at a booth shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the door glanced at her husband, as if waiting to see his reaction before she formed her own. They had all heard it. Linda had left just enough room for plausible deniability, but there was no mistaking what she meant. Shaq exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, not out of frustration, not out of anger, out of calculation. The old fan overhead creaked as it spun, pushing around air that had suddenly grown heavier than before. Linda's stance hadn't changed. She was still standing with her arms crossed, still wearing that same self-satisfied smirk, still believing she had won this little exchange. Shaq wasn't angry. He had no reason to be. Anger was loud. Anger was messy. And he didn't need either of those things to win. Instead, he simply nodded, as if digesting what she had just said. Then, with a slow, casual motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Linda's smirk twitched, her confidence momentarily shaken. Because she had expected an argument, a scene, a raised voice. But not this, not the ease with which he complied. He flipped open his wallet and pulled out another $100 bill, crisp and clean. He held it between two fingers, then placed it on the counter. All right, he said, his tone as casual as if they were discussing the weather. Run it. For a brief second, Linda didn't move, because she realized something she didn't like. She had just lost control of the conversation, and in that split-second hesitation, the diner noticed. The woman with the newspaper glanced over the top of her pages, suddenly more interested in this exchange than her crossword puzzle. A man at the corner booth lowered his fork mid-bite, his pancakes momentarily forgotten. Even the cook behind the counter, a man named Mike who had worked here for over 20 years, stopped scraping the grill and simply watched. The tension in the room had shifted. Linda had been winning. And now she had no idea what game they were even playing anymore. Mike had seen a lot of things in this diner. Fights, breakups, people storming out over cold coffee or burnt toast. But this was something else. He could feel it happening in real time, the way power had just shifted without a single raised voice. Linda looked at him now, expectantly, as if waiting for backup. But Mike didn't move. He didn't say a word. Because he knew better. This wasn't something he could fix, not now. And so, he did what a lot of people do in moments like this. Nothing. In the back of the diner, tucked away in a booth near the window, someone was watching more intently than the rest. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't reacted. But she had reached for her phone the moment she saw Linda smirk. Her name was Samantha Reyes, a young journalist fresh out of college, with an eye for stories that revealed more than just words. And this was a story. She had seen it happen before. Bias disguised as policy, discrimination passed off as standard procedure. And she had seen how these moments, if captured at the right time, had the power to ignite something bigger. So, as Shaq placed the $100 bill down and Linda hesitated, Samantha did the one thing that would make sure this moment wouldn't die in silence. She hit record. Linda didn't know yet. Didn't realize that her face, her smirk, her hesitation had already been immortalized in pixels and data, waiting to be uploaded, shared, and exposed. She was still too caught up in her own moment of pride, in her belief that she had successfully put a man in his place. She finally reached for the bill, plucking it off the counter like it might burn her fingers. She walked over to the register, punched in the amount, and swiped the $100 bill under the scanner. The receipt printed. She snatched it up, walked back, and slammed it onto the counter in front of Shaq. "There," she said, her voice colder than before. "Paid in full." Shaq didn't pick it up right away. He just looked at it, then at Linda. And finally, he smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. The kind of smile that made people nervous, because Shaq knew something Linda didn't. He knew that moment. It wasn't over. Not even close. The receipt sat there, untouched. Linda, still standing stiffly, glanced at Mike again, waiting for reassurance that she had done the right thing. But Mike still said nothing, because Mike was watching something unfold that he wanted no part of. Samantha, still holding her phone steady, knew exactly what had just happened. She had captured the look in Shaq's eyes, the moment Linda realized she had messed up, the way the entire diner was now watching. And Shaq? He was patient. He had all the time in the world. Because this wasn't about breakfast anymore. This wasn't about a $12 meal. This was about something bigger. And everyone in the diner could feel it. Because whatever happened next, no one was ready for it. The tension in Maplewood Diner was no longer subtle. It wasn't just an awkward moment, the kind people brushed off and forgot about 5 minutes later. No, this was different. This was the kind of moment that latched onto people, the kind that made them rethink things, question things, whisper about it later to their friends. And the worst part? No one could ignore it anymore. Shaq sat there, his broad frame relaxed, his fingers still resting lightly on the untouched receipt. His presence alone was enough to make everyone hyper-aware of what had just happened. And now, he was going to make sure they heard it. He didn't slam his fist on the counter. He didn't raise his voice in anger. He didn't need to. All he did was speak. Louder this time, clear, sharp, undeniable. "Why do I have to pay up front when nobody else does?" The diner's air shifted instantly. No one spoke. Not even the usual clatter of dishes from the kitchen could break the silence. It was like everyone knew this moment was bigger than just a simple question. At a nearby table, a middle-aged couple had been eating quietly. The woman, blonde, maybe in her early 50s, stiffened slightly. She exchanged a glance with her husband, who cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. They weren't looking at Shaq. They were looking at Linda. Because they had been here before. And they knew what was coming next. Linda's fingers tightened around her waitress pad, her knuckles turning white. She hadn't expected pushback. Not from someone like him. Not like this. Her smirk was gone, replaced with something else. Something forced. A quick, breathy laugh, as if the whole thing was just a silly misunderstanding. "Oh, come on," she said, her voice too light, too fake. "It's just policy. That's all." She waved a hand like it was no big deal. But no one was buying it. Not Shaq. And definitely not the people watching. At the corner booth, the older woman who had been flipping through a newspaper finally spoke up. "That's funny," she muttered, just loud enough for people to hear. Linda's head snapped toward her. "What?" The woman raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "I said that's funny," she repeated, her tone cool, deliberate. "Because my husband and I have been coming here for years, and we've never had to pay up front." Her husband, sitting across from her, nodded in agreement. Shaq leaned back slightly, tapping the counter with his fingers. Linda's face flushed. She knew. Everyone in the room knew. But before she could come up with another weak excuse, someone else stepped in. Mike, the diner's manager, had been standing near the kitchen the entire time, watching, waiting. He had hoped, prayed, that this would all just blow over. But now it was bigger than him. He sighed, finally stepping forward, rubbing the back of his neck like a man who didn't want to do this but had no choice. "All right," he said, raising a hand. "That's enough." All eyes turned to him. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. Mike exhaled, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Look, we have the right to refuse service," he said, his voice slow, careful. "If there's a problem, we can cancel the order. No harm, no foul." A few heads turned in his direction, shocked he had actually said it out loud. Shaq let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "No harm, no foul," he repeated, shaking his head slightly. "That's the best you got?" Mike's jaw tightened. "I don't make the rules," he said quickly. "I just enforce them." Shaq's eyebrow lifted. "Interesting," he mused, "because I've been looking around this diner for the last 10 minutes, and I don't see a single rule posted anywhere that says you have to pay up front." Mike hesitated. The journalist in the back, Samantha, was still recording, and she knew exactly what was happening. Mike had backed himself into a corner. And Shaq? He wasn't going to let him walk out of it so easily. For a moment, the room hung in uncertainty. Would Mike double down? Would Linda try to change the subject again? Or would someone, anyone, try to stop this train from crashing? Shaq decided for them. Instead of arguing, instead of yelling, instead of making a scene, he did something no one expected. He laughed. Not forced, not sarcastic. A real, deep, amused laugh. Then, shaking his head, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and this time, he didn't pull out 100. He pulled out a black titanium credit card, the kind of card that had no limit, the kind of card that spoke for itself. The diner watched in stunned silence as he tapped it against the counter, letting it clink against the hard surface before setting it down. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, controlled, icy. "Run it for 1,000. Linda blinked. "What?" Shaq's smile widened. "You heard me," he said. "Run it for 1,000. Keep the change." Gasps. Actual gasps. The couple near the window leaned in. The cook behind the grill nearly dropped his spatula. Linda? She looked like she had been slapped across the face. Mike's face had turned pale, his hands suddenly clammy. Because this wasn't just a response. This was a statement that said, "You tried to humiliate me. Now I'm going to humiliate you." Linda's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the card. Because now she realized exactly who she was dealing with. Mike wasn't breathing. The customers? Frozen. Waiting. And Shaq? Shaq was still sitting there, calm as ever, because he had already won. And the best part? He hadn't even needed to raise his voice. 4. The unexpected turn. The moment that changes everything. Linda's smirk had been unwavering up until now. She had played this game before. She knew how it ended, or at least she thought she did. Shaq sat there, still as calm as ever, still relaxed, still composed. But there was something different now. A shift, a charge in the air that everyone in the diner could feel. Instead of anger, instead of frustration, he smirked. Not forced, not exaggerated, just enough to make Linda second-guess everything. Then, with deliberate ease, he reached into his pocket. Not for cash, not for loose change, for a sleek, black credit card. Not just any card, the kind of card that had no limit. The kind of card that could buy this entire diner twice over without blinking. He tapped it against the counter. Once,